Hi. Hi. Hello. So nice to see everyone here tonight. I'm Marika. I'm the Executive Director of the Cambridge Historical Society, and I've prepared a very long speech. How many people here in the audience are members of the Cambridge Historical Society? Show of hands, please. Good. Oh, great. That's great. For those of you who did not raise your hands, we are welcome to make you members tonight. You can give cash, credit card, small children, whatever you have. We will take that and sign you up as members. If you don't want to sign up tonight, you can go to our website when you get home tonight or any other night. CambridgeHistory.org. This guy. You may know that we are a private nonprofit. We do not receive any funding from the city, the state, or federal levels, so all of your support is welcomed and needed. So I do hope that you will sign up. We rely on the generosity of Canterbridgians like you to continue programs like these. If you have any questions, I would actually like now to point out the Society's board members. If my board members could please stand up and raise their hands. These are the experts, hey Liz, that you can talk to. And if you see the name tag, go after them. Woohoo! Try to stump them, they love that. In addition to the generous support of our members, I would like to thank our sponsors for this Housing for All series. Alexandria Real Estate Equities, Bullfinch Properties, Capital One Cafe, they helped us out with a delicious coffee in the back, HYM Investment Group, Eastern Bank, Harvard Square Business Association, Graffito SP, Leader Bank, North Cambridge Cooperative Bank, and Whole Foods. Thank you. Applause. I can't clap. There you go. Extra special thanks to our lead sponsors, Cambridge Savings Bank and Mass Foundation for the Humanities. Additional applause. Even more thanks to the Cambridge Community Center, to Darren and his team for hosting us here. Who is at the CCC for the first time? Isn't it great? What a wonderful venue. Final question. How many of you attended our first conversation 2 weeks ago at the library? Great, well, welcome back and thanks for coming. So why is the Cambridge Historical Society holding a series about housing? We recently made a very important decision. Because we believe that the history of our city is relevant to our lives today, going forward, we will focus on issues that we as a city are facing and offer the historical perspective. We intend to help you understand how we got here so we can all think about solutions, so we can problem solve better and smarter. We intend to use history as a guidebook. The stories, motivations, interests, and decisions of those who came before us need to be told, explained, and discussed. That said, we do not see ourselves as a current issues forum. Instead, our goal is to slow down these issues and use history to examine them. We're asking each other, how did we get here? What happened and why? What's my role, my responsibility in solving the problem? That's history's job, and that's the job of our historical society. We use stories, your personal experiences, your history, to make sense of the world today. And how are we doing that? Through the humanities. We're approaching this issue that is on the minds of everyone in Cambridge through a humanities lens, specifically a historical one. This is different from how other groups approach these topics. Where they use data, we use stories. By taking perspective. Through our expert panelists, we are providing you with background so you have more information to inform your conclusions. We hope that this background augments what you already know. We hope some information will surprise you and you'll want to share it with others in your life. Finally, we create empathy. As you no doubt have already heard me say, history is everything. History is not just the pursuit of armchair history buffs or memorizing battle dates. It's not static facts. It's the web of stories that define us as human beings. It is the remembering and reflecting on the events of the past so we become more empathetic, caring people. So we're humbled. so we are better citizens. So together we make a better city, a better world. That's the work of historians, amateur or professional, and that's what we're hoping to do tonight. There's so much to cover on this topic. We have 3 events, and we could well have had a dozen. And of course, Cambridge has such a historical past, many, many years, and we are skipping over much of it, so thank you for understanding that. I want to review 3 ground rules for tonight. They can also be found in your conversation guide. Active listening. Pause and repeat back in your head what you heard before speaking or raising your hand. Don't just hear, absorb all you've observed. 2, ask questions based on genuine curiosity. And 3, think and speak with empathy. Be a historian. That is, understand the life circumstances swirling around a person understand that the life circumstances swirling around a person is what led them to a decision. Think about these conditions before passing judgment. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Tonight's event features a discussion between 3 speakers and our moderator. We will then open up the conversation to you through this microphone here at the front. We also have note cards where you can write down your questions, and please remember to write down a question, not a comment. Thank you. What we discussed tonight will not be forgotten. We're being recorded by our friends here at CCTV. It's going to air in a couple of weeks. Hooray, CCTV! We're also taking notes and writing down everything that we all say. And the reason we're doing this is, 1, the city is working on a master plan, Envision Cambridge, and we're passing everything we talk about up to them to inform their decisions. And 2, all your thoughts are going down in the historical record in our archives. And how wonderful is that, to understand what a city is feeling in a certain year around a certain topic for everyone in the future. You can follow us tonight on Twitter. Anybody planning on tweeting here in the audience? I think Pamela's already tweeting. We're at CambridgeHS, and the hashtag is Housing for All. The speakers from all 3 conversations, not just tonight, have sent us suggestions for further reading. That's in your guidebook, so I hope you'll check that out. Most importantly for us, we are a historical organization, so we have an archive, and there are 3 wonderful archives for you to go do primary research, because research with the actual real document is the best. We have our archive at the Cambridge Historical Society, Emily Gonzalez at the Cambridge Historical Commission, and Alyssa Pacey at the Cambridge Public Library are all willing and able for you to go to talk to them, to learn about your house, your neighborhood, and to see some actual documents. So I hope you'll take them up on that. Finally, there's a survey in your guide, on your chairs. Please fill that out. It's very helpful for us. We actually do listen. We're also going to be sending an electronic version, so if you can fill that one out too. Finally, the bathrooms are near where you came in, up the ramp and out the door. That's very important. I'm pleased and honored to share the stage today with such great Cambridge experts for this very important discussion. Unfortunately, our friend Chris Arnold could not be here tonight because of breaking news coverage, so he's doing some great work. But in his stead, we're lucky enough to secure his former colleague, Curt Nickisch. Curt's voice may be familiar to you because he covered business and technology in Boston for WBUR and NPR for 10 years. His topics included the housing market, the mortgage crisis, and the local economy. Not only does he help us out of last-minute jams, he also put the Hooper Lee Nichols House radiators on a timer, pulled rusty paint cans out of our garage, and listens to me philosophize about history almost every day. The reason he does that is not only because he's a huge fan of the Cambridge Historical Society, but he is also my husband. So before we turn it over to Curt and the panelists, I would like to introduce the Society's Doing History Curator, Diana Lempel, who will be reading a short passage to help set tonight's tone. Thank you.
From the Cambridge Zoning Ordinance Preamble. Closer? Okay. It shall be the purpose of this ordinance to lessen congestion in the streets, conserve health, to secure safety from fire, flood, panic, and other danger, to provide adequate light and air, to prevent overcrowding of land, to avoid undue concentration of population, to encourage housing for persons of all income levels, to facilitate the adequate provision of transportation, water supply, drainage, sewerage, schools, parks, open space, and other public requirements, to conserve the value of land and buildings, including the conservation of natural resources and the prevention of blight and pollution of the environment, to encourage the most rational use of land throughout the city, including the encouragement of appropriate economic development, the protection of residential neighborhoods from incompatible activities, and including the consideration of plans and policies, if any, adopted by the Cambridge Planning Board, and to preserve and increase the amenities of the city.
Thank you, Diana. That sounds like a place I want to live. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to sort of lead this conversation with these great panelists, but also with all of you. It's really great to see everybody who came here, to see all these faces, and people who made it through the rain to make it here. So we're looking forward to having a conversation about history, but about today, and our role in it, and our role in creating that community that we just heard about. So let's get started. We're busy people. I want to just make some quick introductions of everybody, and then we'll get the discussion rolling. Let me start here to my left, and Cheryl-Ann Pizza-Zeoli is one of the founding members of the Alliance of Cambridge Tenants, and for the past 7 years has served as the chair of its Policy Advocacy Committee. This is in addition to many other organizations and boards in which she's played a leadership and an activist role, right? That's fair to say. To her left is Greg Russ. He's in his 12th year as executive director of the Cambridge Housing Authority. Among the things he's done is securing and implementing the city's housing preservation program, rebuilding the housing at Jefferson Park, working with hard-to-house families and homeless residents. Before this job, he ran his own consulting firm and worked in other major cities over a 40-year career. So Greg, thanks for being here. And then to his left is Jim Stockard. He is a specialist and consultant in affordable housing and public housing. He recently retired as the curator of the Harvard Graduate School of Design's Loeb Fellowship. And he also worked with Congress to mandate the public housing ownership cost study, which resulted in the first significant change in how public housing is funded since the program's inception in 1937 during the New Deal. It's amazing. And Jim, it's great to have you here. And you're also going to kind of set the table for us. You're going to maybe bring us up to speed with some history of how we got here and what Cambridge has done up until now, so that we can start talking about today and tomorrow.
Thank you, Curt. Is this on?
It is on. You can definitely hold it up close.
Is it good? Okay.
I can also turn you up. So does everybody hear him okay, or should I turn his volume up a little bit?
I assume I need the microphone for CCTV. Because I've got a very loud voice, but let's do this. First of all, this is going to get a little geeky, and I apologize, but I do think it will be useful for you in not only understanding some of the things that we talk about, but also thinking in your own light about solutions to these issues in Cambridge. So, fact, we have a big affordable housing problem in Cambridge. I know that doesn't come as a shock, but if you read the Chronicle this morning, 6,800 people applied for a Section 8 mobile voucher in 4 or 5 days, Greg? 2 weeks. That's a huge need and way beyond the capacity. Most of those people will end up on a waiting list for years. Nationally, the Joint Center for Housing Studies says 43 million households, that's 110 million people, pay more than 30% of their income for rent, which means they're troubled in terms of housing. So this is a national problem and as well as a local problem. So I want to say a couple of vocabulary things and some dates to help you understand what Cambridge has done about this. So first, a little bit, if you'll excuse me, a couple of vocabulary things. Housing cost and housing price are two very different things. Housing cost is the result of labor and materials and interest on your construction loan, and it's a kind of a number that varies across the country, but not dramatically. Housing price is an entirely different thing based on supply and demand. When supply and demand are out of whack, when more people want to live in a particular place than there is housing for those people, the price goes up. It's a good classic law of capitalist economics, and it's true in this case. So in Cambridge, the reason for our outrageous prices for housing is not so much that the cost is outrageous, although it's quite high. It's because demand and supply are out of whack. There is a seemingly infinite demand for people to want to live in Cambridge, and a very, very restricted ability to increase the supply. So that's why our prices are so high. It's not because the lumber costs more here than it does in Western Massachusetts. Now, one other thing that one other vocabulary thing that I want to talk about is this question about how housing finance works. It's not as complicated as you think it is. Just some basic vocabulary. If these are the costs involved in developing a housing property, that is the land that you take to build it on, or the building you acquire, and the labor and the materials, all the things we're just talking about, those will add up to something that people in this business call the total development cost, right? And so to pay for this, you need to do two things. You need to borrow some money, and you've got some money of your own. If you're a homeowner, it's the down payment is the equity, and you have to borrow some money for your mortgage, right? So if we subtract from this the equity, that leaves the mortgage. And over here on this side, we have the operating budget. Again, a whole bunch of costs: mowing the lawn, painting the halls, collecting the rents, advertising, marketing, etc. Whole bunch of costs that relate to the price of housing, what we're going to charge for it. And at the bottom down here, we've got a total operating cost. One of the costs of operating is paying the mortgage. So there's a relationship between this side and that side, right? So one of these numbers goes like that. And then if we divide the total operating cost by 12, we've got the monthly operating cost. And if we divide it again by the number of units, we've got roughly what you have to pay for rent each month, right? So that equals the rent. Now, if you happen to be in a place where the supply and demand are out of whack, this number here, which is developer's profit, can be as high as you want it to be, right? If we're in a town without much of a demand and supply, this has got to be just a little bit above cost. At least it's got to be, nobody will build it if it's not a little bit above cost. So there are three ways, and this is why I did this funny little diagram, there are three ways to make the rent go down, to make it more affordable for somebody. The first thing you can do is reduce the development costs, right? You can say, we'll give you free land. We'll sell you lumber for half price. Any way we can do it, we'll make this number go down, so this number goes down, so your equity will cover more, but you have to borrow less money, right? And if we give somebody a favor over here, then we can demand they charge lower rents. So the Cambridge Public Housing Authority, when it first built housing, was given essentially 100% discount on this. They got a grant to do this, no cost at all. So it was all equity. There was no mortgage, so they could charge lower rents. The second way to finance, reduce cost, is to reduce something on the operating side. No more real estate taxes. Now our rents can go down. Free advertising, our rents can go down. So that's the second way to do it, is give an operating cost. The Cambridge Housing Authority and many of our nonprofits get a subsidy to operate their property on the operating side after it's already built. The third way to subsidize it is to give the resident something and help them pay the rent. So we can give a resident a certificate that would help them pay the rent, and they can go shop in the marketplace, and we can forget about all this stuff. We've just helped them be able to pay the rent that the market is charging. Now, there is an important difference in these three things. On this side and on that side, we're subsidizing cost. Down here, we're subsidizing price, right? Because we got to go to the market. So, let me see. So one last thing before I do a little geeky chart here. The federal government and the local governments have tried all three of these things, and they're still happening. We do all three of these things in one way or another. But there's a general rule about where the assistance comes from. In general, money comes from the federal government. The state and local governments don't have as much money. The states typically do nothing about housing. They have an enabling act for the zoning ordinance, and that's about it. Local communities mostly contribute regulatory devices, right? They have a zoning ordinance. They have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. They have other kinds of systems that make the housing cheaper because of the rules they make, not the money they can put into it, okay? And in general, for 80 years, our policies at every level have favored homeowners over renters. They've favored the wealthy over those of more modest means. They've favored men over women. And they've favored white people over people of a different skin color. And to tell you a little bit more about that, here comes my geeky chart. See if I can avoid falling off the stage here.
So this is my sole contribution tonight is the chart holding.
I was going to put it up here, Greg, but that's all right. We're going to put it over there.
Hold it high then.
So here's the story. The federal government, the state government, and the local government, right? The federal government's first housing authority was in 1913. You may not remember that none of you were alive. Before 1913, there was no federal income tax in this country. The federal government collected its money in different ways. The first federal income tax we made up there gave a break to homeowners. You can deduct from your income the amount of interest you pay on your loan. You can deduct from your income the amount of money you pay on real estate taxes. That lowers your income and therefore lowers your taxes. That remains to this day the largest subsidy we have for housing in this country, $120 billion a year. Roughly speaking, if you own a home that costs more than $250,000 or is valued at more than $250,000, you probably receive more tax incentive every year than an individual living in public housing gets as a subsidy. Just think about that for a minute. So later we created FHA, which insured mortgages. That was a way for homeowners to be able to get a loan after the Depression, because the banks were scared of people, and they both made the banks safer and made the individuals safer. Then we started public housing in 1937. The minute we wrote the Public Housing Act at the Congress, Cambridge created the Cambridge Housing Authority. So we want to take advantage of that program right away in this city. A few years later, unlike almost any other state in the country, there are 3 other states in the country that do this, we started a state-funded public housing program. Chapter 200 for veterans. Nobody else in the country has anywhere near our program of state assistance. The feds, unhappy with public housing, began to change a little bit the kind of programs they used. We created Chapter 667 for elderly folks. 1965, HUD was formed. More state action, Chapter 705 for large families. HUD changed the program again from public housing. This was for the purpose of attracting for-profits into the game of affordable housing. Those guys know how to do it. We'll just incentivize them to build the affordable housing for us, and they'll make a profit at it, but that's okay because they're so efficient that they'll be better at it than the public guys are. Chapter 40B in 1969, Massachusetts did something no other state has done. Create a law which allows the state to override local zoning if you haven't done enough affordable housing in your city. It's built about 50,000 homes throughout Massachusetts in this year since its development. It was a very bold move by the state. We can't use it in Cambridge because even when it was passed, we had more than 10% affordable housing in our town. So that hasn't made much of a difference for us, but it's an indication of our state's willingness to step into this game. The Brooke Amendment in 1971 said you can't charge people in public housing any more than 25% of their income. Housing authorities had a big loss of income because some of their residents were paying more than that. Housing authorities for a couple of years were writing checks to their residents to make up for the overage that they'd charged them. In 1970, just before that, here's our 3 nonprofits. We have 3 great nonprofits in Cambridge. Just to Start started in '68, came out of the urban renewal program. RCCC happened in '71, RHRI in '72, and CASCAP in '73. We passed rent control in 1970. It was a big way to put a lid on the marketplace. We could talk about rent control if you want to. The Nixon moratorium stopped all the housing programs. After he left office, we created some new ones. The Section 8 program arrived, and that changed the way we did subsidies, put in place for the first time one of those subsidies to residents. Up to now, we're always subsidizing developers. This is the first time we said we can help the residents directly and let them shop in the regular marketplace. One more state program, 689, with people with disabilities. Brook went to 30% from the 25% mark up here. Later, we created the low-income housing tax credit program, a whole complex device to say we need to find a way to get more equity into this development side, and we got a way to get private money into the subsidized housing business. It's creative, it's long around the barn, and basically what it says is we're willing to reduce tax revenues of big corporations in order to get some more affordable housing built. We can talk about that some more in detail if you want to. McKinney was an act for the homeless folks. In 1988, we passed our first incentive zoning, which said if you're building stuff in Cambridge that is making more people want to live here, office space, retail space, laboratory space, you need to give us some money to build some more housing so that demand and supply don't get more out of whack. So this was a creative act that started in 1988. In 1989, we created the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in Cambridge. Again, something where we led most of the state in doing this, said, look, we got to have a body of people in this town that knows how to allocate money to the various developers, these guys up here mostly, who will build affordable housing in our town. It's been very successful since 1989. Big program for public housing change here and here. In 1994, the state took rent control away from us in Cambridge. So that goes in both these columns. We passed our first inclusionary ordinance in 1998. I'm sure everybody in this room is aware that these two have just been redone to become more aggressive as development gets more and more aggressive in this town. CPA was passed in 2000 as a way of helping towns collect money, a slight increase in real estate taxes, so they could get a little bit more money in order to do housing as well as open space and historic preservation. We created a CPA cap right after that. Boston, for example, still has not passed CPA. It's on the ballot in Boston this year. So that's a long list to say the feds have tried a number of things, different ways to give out money. 40s and 50s, they liked public bodies. 60s and 70s, they liked for-profits. They gave up on those guys because their hand was in the till a little bit too much. 80s and 90s, they went to the nonprofits. Whole new idea. We could have nonprofits build housing. These guys were already doing it. They were able to take more advantage of the programs down here. This tax shelter program is particularly attractive for nonprofits. So the feds have kept giving out money in different kinds of ways. Our state has stepped up to create public housing programs and a nice zoning program. And our local communities have formed the nonprofits they need, passed the legislation they need, and made the kinds of improvements to the allocation of funds that have allowed us, in spite of all these outrageous costs of public housing, to keep building that in this town. Let's hang it up. Can we hang it up over here, Greg, so people can read it over here? So, one quick summary. I know I wrote down a summary. So, here's what I meant earlier. As you can see from the chart, 1913 and FHA, the feds took care of the homeowners first. Only when we got to the point where the Depression and later World War II were scaring us about rental housing did the federal government decide we have to do some rental housing and help people of modest means be able to afford that housing. The two largest programs, it's interesting to note, the two biggest subsidy programs in the country, the mortgage interest reduction and the low-income housing tax credit, are run by, it must be HUD. No, it's the IRS, which will give you an idea of the Congress's confidence in HUD. And then I guess I wanted to say what I really just said, I would say that our city has done a rather excellent job of taking advantage of every opportunity they had to make it possible for more people to afford to live in Cambridge. And in spite of that, we're still in trouble. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's a great place to end it. Yeah. Thank you. Cheryl-Ann, I want to start with you because I neglected to say that you've lived in Cambridge since 1979. For most of that time in Inman Square in a high-rise building that back in 1973, sort of in this era that we're talking about too, was opposed by neighbors who wanted to stop high-rises and preserve Inman Square. And when you look back on this history, and what comes to mind? I mean, you've been involved in public and affordable housing since that time in this city, and I just hearing Jim talk about that, what runs through your mind?
Well, I think about the place where I live, Inman Square Apartments.
Let me interrupt you just for 1 second. I also just wanted to say that I realize we're in an echoey room. If you can't hear somebody or need it turned up or down, just come and get my attention and I'll do my best. So did everybody hear Cheryl? Okay. Cheryl-Ann? Okay, great. Go for it. Sorry to interrupt.
All right, so Inman Square Apartments has 116 apartments for individuals, for families. It has 17 three-bedroom apartments. So, yes, there was opposition to giving a zoning variance for this building back in '73, and I have the poster of the neighborhood getting together to oppose this. But from my perspective, well, for all of those years, for all of those decades, it's provided stable, affordable housing for how many people? So you've hit on sort of the most controversial issue, I think, in Cambridge right now. It has to do with density and development. And everybody in the room will probably agree that affordable housing is, a wonderful idea. But then we talk about what trade-offs are involved, what policy trade-offs, the costs, the consequences for the larger community, and then we all will disagree very strongly, I think. But that's a discussion that we need to have. What I would say is that since the end of rent control, there's a really important statistic that I wanted to mention. We've lost, and I hate to do the numbers then, but for people who are in the 50 to 80% area median income, that income range, we've lost since 1990, that population has declined by almost 49%. Okay, so think about that. Think about how significant that is and how it's changed the community. And Jim mentioned the inclusionary program. That is a hot topic right now that the City Council will have to make some decisions about, including these policy trade-offs. And that program targets people in that income group. The other thing to know is that half of the people who live in those inclusionary units have vouchers, most of them from the CHA. So it also serves, it's more deeply affordable because of that. And the issue to keep in mind is that if you have a mobile voucher, you can move, right? Say your circumstances change. You have mobility. I happen to think that mobility is a right, but where will you move to? Okay, some data has recently come from the CHA about how many people are actually able to use those vouchers. A lot of people have taken the vouchers and moved outside of Cambridge to find family-size apartments, and they are willing to pay more than 30% of their income for rent. So this notion of affordability is something to really think about throughout the discussion. Is it 25% of your income for housing? Is it 30%? Well, there are very poor families who are now paying over 40% outside of Cambridge with a rental subsidy to find family housing.
Greg, I want to bring you into this conversation because your career has sort of spanned a lot of these changes as well, here and elsewhere. And we've heard about just all of the efforts that have made to sort of tackle this problem from different angles. But we still end up at the place where Jim left us. Why is that? Is it because these programs have not made a dent or haven't been helpful? We just heard from Cheryl-Ann that they have made a difference for many people that she's lived with. But have they fallen short, or are they just simply, or have they been well executed, but the problem is just still too big?
I think there's probably not a simple answer to that, but just some observations. It's going to take me a moment because I was alarmed to see that I actually take up half the chart now, and that was interesting. But I'd say there's a couple of things.
You held up the whole one though,
yeah,
so that's
I know,
good.
But the programs that we have, housing is not considered. It's not an entitlement program.
Does everybody hear Greg okay?
So
can you hold it up just a little bit?
Since it's not an entitlement program, that means it's competitively provided. And then once you do that, you wind up in a situation where we're taking applications now for the voucher program. Folks are on waiting lists. There's sometimes preferences and priorities applied to that. But the bottom line is that not everyone will receive either a subsidy or a unit. So if you think kind of at the larger scale, as Jim's history tends to force us, and then you come to Cheryl-Ann's place where there's an individual at the end of that program, if I could use that phrase. The issue is where have we chosen to put our resources? Now, locally, Cambridge does just a tremendous job of infusing as much as it can, both in terms of the regulatory and financially as well, well beyond what many cities do who are much, much larger than us. And I'd have to say that relationship is extremely powerful and very, very welcome if you're on the housing supply side like we are. But less so at the state, and then nationally, to go back to the point that Jim made, even if I add up all the money that's available for the voucher program, say this year it's edging in the $20 to $21 billion of the budget. Then compare that number to the mortgage interest deduction. And where is the larger...
You're talking federal numbers here,
yes,
right?
federal
Okay.
numbers. Where is the larger benefit? And my own view is that unless we redistribute some of those resources, we'll be stuck at the funding levels we are now. And essentially, on the voucher side, Congress is appropriating only enough money to satisfy the demand for the existing vouchers. There are no new chunks of vouchers, very limited numbers of vouchers being added to the federal budget, which means there's not much of a chance to expand the program. So,
as the population grows, that
right.
that actually means it's shrinking.
Yes, that's correct. It actually means it's shrinking, and on the public housing side, which we've actually contracted in terms of the amount of money that's being provided to support the units. So I do see the capacity question, how many families can be served, as a question of resource distribution, and we've chosen at the national level not to distribute resources in the same way to folks with low income that we've chosen to do, say, in the home ownership realm. I'm not knocking home ownership, just that's how the policies have worked out.
Okay, so let's jump just from the national level to the city level, because the state sounds like is almost out of the picture there for much of this. How have the priorities been in Cambridge?
Well, I think the priorities here, speaking as a practitioner, are I think they're very strong. I think what we have to think about going forward is what's the set of local things we might be able to do We can regulate zoning, we can regulate planning, we can think about, we have the housing trust, and that provides some cash to developers of low-income housing and owners who want to preserve existing units. I think the next question for us is, if the federal resource has shrunk, does Cambridge get into the business of trying to increase the amount of resources that are actually provided to do low-income housing? And if so, what's the vehicle for that?
Okay. That's a great question, which gets back to sort of the political will,
Right.
and the citizen involvement eventually too, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about that. How would that work? Like, what's on the table?
Do we have a housing movement? Do we need a housing movement to change how we all think about this? I had recommended that all of you read Catherine Bauer, a very short essay where she asked this question. Actually, the book is America Can't Have Housing. And this is something that was written in 1934. And she had high hopes back then. And she wanted, she thought of the housing movement as a consumer's movement and a workers' movement. So of course, she imagined that we'd all be living in some form of subsidized housing, but we would all have a say in what that housing looked like, right? That it's not enough to have brilliant architects and planners and technicians. That doesn't amount to a housing movement. You need the people who are going to live in that housing to be able to have a say in that. And so, I deal with people in crisis all the time, and so most days I say, well, I can't wait for the housing movement. But I would like to hear from people here, since you're all historians, what you think of that and what that would look like. And you're talking about political will. Housing doesn't poll well. In Cambridge, it's the number one issue in every citizen survey, but nationally.
Yeah. It's funny that we're talking about the 1930s. It comes up again and again, a time when the economy was doing terribly. And we're talking about some of these same problems at a time when the economy in Cambridge is doing perhaps better than ever. Jim, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to underline what Cheryl's been saying and be extremely explicit about it. I had a chance to spend some time in Scotland recently, and after the first few interviews I did with housing professionals over there, I began to ask the next set of people I interviewed, do I understand this correctly? Because in their country, and everybody agreed this was the right answer, it is a civic responsibility, all of us, to make sure that everybody has a decent home. Now, in the 1949 Housing Act, we said it shall be the policy of the United States government to assure that there is a decent home in a suitable living environment for every American as soon as practical. 65 years? Does that seem like as soon as practical? All of which is, and I contrast that Scottish feeling with what Greg pointed out, and the short way to think of it for me is, in this country, affordable housing is a lottery. And we have provided about enough money that your chances of prevailing in the lottery are 1 in 4. Better than the Massachusetts lottery, but the other 3/4 of people who don't get this, their loss is much greater than throwing a scratch ticket in the trash can. So, do we want to be a society where housing is a lottery? Or do we want to be a society where we believe that everybody is entitled to a decent place to live? And I don't mean a motel room. One last little example. The average homeless child moves 3 times a year. That's 3 different schools, 3 different teachers, 3 different times when they have to make friends. What are the chances that that child is going to end up being a contributor to our society? Many make it. I don't want to say that they don't. Many make it. But we are really stacking the odds against that child. The number of teachers that I've heard who will say, if only I could count on Johnny being here every day and I didn't lose Johnny for 2 months. Or Jane didn't show up in my classroom halfway through the year, and I have to try to bring her up to speed. This is not just a giveaway program. This is a question of who we are as a country and as a city. And to some crude extent, if you prefer it, it's in our self-interest. If you want to be selfish about it, it's in our self-interest. I'd prefer not to be selfish. I'd prefer to think we're the kind of society that wants to make this happen. So one thing for us to talk about as citizens is, what's our action? What is our housing movement? And a national housing movement is one thing. There's the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, great group that works lobbying at the national level. What's the housing movement in Cambridge? What's the housing movement in your neighborhood? Because as much as we'd like to think it's changed, this is a flash. I know that this will come as a shock to you. There is actually some NIMBYism in Cambridge. A few chuckles. What's the housing movement like at the neighborhood level, at the block level?
Let's stay on this neighborhood and block level and give us a sense. I think any of you can jump in here. What is the situation for affordable housing? What is the sort of unmet demand for affordable housing in middle income brackets and maybe low income brackets? Is that different? It's obviously stressful for people at the very low end of the income spectrum, but it's also very less stressful. But it's a huge issue. One of the reasons why it's number one right on those surveys for people who make more money. So I just want to get a sense of, what is the demand for that housing in Cambridge, and where are the real bottlenecks?
Well, a couple of comments to that. We really, as a housing authority, are making investments in the preservation of units that have already been built or we already own and operate. There's a very few points at the margins where we're adding units to the housing stock. And then inside that box, that sort of supply box plus the voucher, you heard the number of voucher families, and I believe if we open the public housing list, we'll probably open the senior list early next year, we'll see another high demand there. And there are a couple things happening. One, if you are a low-income family or individual, you're really almost your only choice is a unit that is subsidized in some fashion. And now Cambridge is, I call it the donut hole of affordability, is much bigger, because if you look at our pricing, there are plenty of services now online. If any of you look up Zillow or Trulia and you begin to look at any of those numbers, working families are priced out of the community at a certain level. So we are in this situation where I feel both we have an inadequate supply of stock for low-income families who might want to take advantage of living here, and we're losing ground, I'd say, in what we might call the working families who can no longer afford to either buy or rent here. And that trend is ominous, I feel.
And
go ahead.
And what's the consequence of that trend? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but what are you afraid of?
I think it's Jim's,
and
the price.
Yeah.
Well, if you're lucky enough to find affordable housing, you may wind up stuck there. I mean, that's another thing that I think a lot about. Is there a way not only to provide more affordable housing and different types of housing, but is there a way to help people move through the system? There are people who live in public housing who pay what's called a ceiling rent, and these are people who have done all the right things, so to speak, followed all the rules, and they are in that 80 to 100% area median income range, and they have multiple wage earners in the household. So these are the most successful families. Think about that in public housing, and I want them to stay in public housing because they're important members of the community. But what if they want to move to inclusionary housing, inclusionary home ownership, or you know, the private market? It's not possible, right? So can the city, the CDD, and the trust, and the CHA look at ways to make that possible? Because then, if those people move to maybe inclusionary home ownership, then there are more units that are deeply affordable that are available.
Cheryl-Ann, that's a good point, because we do have many families working in our properties. It's true to some extent also with voucher holders. So that kind of stereotype of the poor don't want a job, that's just not true. And because we have so many, we have about 90 families in the category that Cheryl-Ann is talking about. And what we don't have is a way to graduate someone out of that property and allow that person potentially to stay here in the city. We haven't gotten strong enough at creating these kinds of pathways. And that is an area, I think, where there could be a lot more discussion. Some of these earnings, if you look at them, are significant. But to Cheryl-Ann's other point, you've got a family of 5 and 4 wage earners. That is, you know, so that even if they're all making $30,000 a year, the number looks quite large till you begin to tease at exactly what's going on. But I do think there would be a way to create a pathway for them to graduate out and into something else. And then the concern for us is, could they stay in Cambridge? In a less inflated, I don't mean that in a negative way, I just mean in terms of the pricing, in a less inflated market, you could say to someone, oh, you live at Washington Elms, Newtown Court, you can move across the street at Harvard Street and find a unit, and in fact you can't. You can't do that because you're priced out. That ceiling rent that Cheryl-Ann mentioned is a high rent, but it's pegged well below market. So we need a stronger path for some of those households who really could maybe make a next step.
Especially as people change jobs more often. I mean, it's just unlikely to think that those 4 wage earners are going to stay doing the same thing for decades.
And I want to add one other thing to Jim's comment. We have now lots of empirical evidence over the benefit of housing subsidies on children, whether they are in a voucher program or in a public housing unit. So you think about, oh gee, these generations of poverty. Well, the contraction in the resources that we're willing to put into these programs has a direct effect on the number of kids that we can put into an environment that would help them succeed. So that is all connected. And it's hard to see, I think, sometimes when we have these arguments. And investments in these children are really important. And housing is a fundamental to making the other things we do for them work. And that's another part of this puzzle.
Gotcha. Jim, I keep cutting you off.
I do think this donut hole that Greg mentioned is an important element. It feels to me as though a really sound and integrated in all kinds of ways community has got people spread across the income spectrum and spread across the age spectrum and spread across all kinds of other spectrums like that. And we're in great danger of having a big gap in the middle. Larry, you know this number better than I probably, but the last time I knew the number, 60% of the children in our public school system lived in affordable housing. And what that means is that our public school experience is lacking in some diversity, lacking in some breadth, lacking in some of the other qualities that make for a really great. We have a very good school system, but it could be even better if we didn't have that hole in the middle of it. So I think this is one of our, Curt, this is one of our big problems, is how we respond to that group of people in the middle, which feel to us like they're in less serious trouble, right? Family by family, they're closer to be able to pay the way, but as a community, if we lose them, we're engaged in becoming a dumbbell place, and that's not healthy for either end of the dumbbell.
Sure.
I want to say something that might be controversial.
Please.
Since I'm an actual poor person, I think it's more important to keep poor people here. There's a lot of research now that backs up the idea that place matters. It really matters for poor people. It determines when you die, and there's a big longevity gap in terms of the top 1% and the bottom 1%. So I want poor kids to stay in Cambridge. Now I want those families to be able to enhance their lives, to do the things that they truly want to do. I want to support that. But I don't want to get all romantic about let's provide housing for the firefighter and teacher who can't afford to stay here. Think about who that middle income family is and how we can support them. And there is a demand for affordable middle income home ownership. There's not so much of a demand for affordable middle income rental housing. And you see it in the number of applications. And I'll just mention a couple. Port Landing, which is 20 units for low-income people, they got over 1,100 applications. So 1,100 applications for 20 units of low-income housing. At Alexandria, there's some affordable middle-income rental units. There were 69 applications for 15 units. Only 43 of the 69 were even income eligible. They were all too poor to be income eligible for this program. It was very hard to fill those units. So we should always question our assumptions about who's middle income. And I hate that we're in this situation that we're all competing for these resources. But there has to be a way. I mean, mobility isn't just you take your voucher and you move someplace else. It's economic mobility. It's self-fulfillment. And I've come really to believe that that's a right. That mobility in all those different meanings, that's a right that people have.
Amen.
So this is a good time for me to ask sort of this, to stay on the controversial track and ask this sort of social engineering question, right? Because all of these programs that have happened in the past did affect who could live certain places, who couldn't, who cities and governments wanted to support, who they didn't. And I'm just wondering what, when you look at Cambridge today and what it's turning into, like what sort of, who should live in Cambridge? And to what extent should the people who live here stay here? Should they be prioritized? Or the people who want to move here, what can you do for them? Or do you have to say to certain people, well, it's just not a good fit, look elsewhere and come work here? I just, like, if you have to design your perfect city for who should be here and who you unfortunately have to say no to, who do you want to help and who would you like to say no to?
Well, what the question you're asking kind of touches on, there are certain tensions in all these choices. So this is one example. I'm not saying it's the only one.
It's just hypothetical.
Yeah, I'm thinking that if I had my choice, or we had our choices, we're going to have to build more densely. There's no way around it.
And just explain that briefly.
Well, that means that we either have to have more, we're going to have more units of whatever kind we're building for, whether that's low or middle or whatever. We're going to need more of them. And given sort of the constraints of the city we occupy, it has to be more dense in order to raise the supply. Now, in some parts of town, I don't think folks would have too much of a problem with that. But the reality is that is not the community we have today. When we look at where, if you go to where we have the tall buildings, the really big ones, and some of our properties stand out, Manning Apartments in Central Square looks like a giant in Central Square, and some folks react negatively to that. But I really think that as a community, if we want more people to be here, we have to increase the supply across a range. To increase the supply means we have to change how we're using the land. And in a sheer numbers thing, I think, to go back to Jim's first example, increasing the supply is one way we could do that. Now, that doesn't mean we've got to build it smart. Mm-hmm. And we have to think about how that's going to look and where it's located. And these are all very subjective things. So I think when you kind of stir this pot of ideas, increasing density, oh yeah, that sounds okay. But the fact is, if you went into a neighborhood and said, well, instead of a 3-story, I want to put an 8, what do you think the reaction would be?
Yeah.
You know, and even though you might have a 8-story 3 blocks away, that doesn't count because this is next to me. These are all real trade-offs that we have to decide.
The irony there is that in order to keep people here and welcome people here, you have to change the...
Correct.
You have to change the city. You have to have it not be the way it is now.
Just to close, I think there's so many things I enjoy about being here, and at times just being able to walk through one of the residential neighborhoods. I mean, that's a great thing. I mean, there's a lot of places in the country you can't do that in a city this size. But in order to address this problem, we have to think about what we're going to build, and we have to think about that differently.
I just wanted to mention Vale Court. Does everybody here know about Vale Court? It was abandoned how many years ago? Quite an eyesore in Bishop Allen Drive. Well, the city just decided to take it by eminent domain. The former city manager, Mr. Rossi, he told me he wanted to do one eminent domain, and that was the one he picked.
He is.
And so what I would say is for people to follow that discussion very closely and come out and support the maximum amount of affordable housing at that site. Because I bet we're going to have this discussion about, well, we can't really go to 4 stories there, and well, we need a community cafe. So follow that closely and jump into that discussion.
Jim, you were nodding and smiling.
Yeah,
there.
one response to your question about Burlington, Vermont has a very nice agreement made up of 7 organizations that they refer to as a ladder of tenure. So they have a homeless shelter in their group. They have the housing authority. They have a nonprofit group that works on first-time home buyers. They have a nonprofit group that has rental housing that's assisted in some ways. And so these 7, what their posture is, whenever anybody comes to this city and wants to know about housing, we should have a place to send them where there's a place in the ladder that they can fit. And as they change, as they grow, as they have other kinds of needs, they get old. One of the groups is an elderly housing group. They make a little more money and they want a little, they should be able to move along the tenure ladder. And we should talk to each other so that we're coordinating and so we make it easy for people so that Greg can talk to the developer of some first-time home buyer stuff and say, we got a couple of residents who ought to be interested in, you might have an information system for some of our residents because they're close, they're ready to this, and you should, so that I think this notion of who, quote, ought to live in Cambridge or should live in Cambridge will change all the time, over time. And the real answer, it seems to me, is to have this ladder of possibilities so that people can find a place along that ladder and then can move along that ladder as their situation changes.
It strikes me that just this whole discussion of scarcity or there not being enough places probably makes people not want to move. It doesn't aid mobility, right? It's sort of everybody wants to be the last person into paradise and then close the door behind them.
Well,
right?
you have hard choices. I mean, these are hard choices. Families who move out with a voucher, I think we're around 47% of our vouchers are outside the city. And the reason is that there's probably a supply and price problem. And those two things are connected. And we live in a state that allows us to continue to administer those vouchers. In many parts of the world, you would lose those vouchers. They would port out to the community where the folks go. Now, we're thinking about actively marketing in future years to some of those voucher families to see if they want to come back when we have the supply. But that's the key question. We would have to have the supply. And to Jim's point, I think that's a great illustration of the different types of housing we need to provide for, some of which touches on transitional, and others accommodates that latter that he describes.
One last thing, Curt. Let me just be clear that we have many of those organizations in Cambridge. Not that they're missing in this town, but we probably and the trust fund and the city's housing staff does quite a good job of connecting them with each other. But that's sort of making that system clear, making it obvious to people who'd like to come here. And one last thing, there is a big elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned quite yet. One of the reasons that the demand for housing is so great in this town is that between our three big educational institutions, Harvard, MIT, and Lesley, there's something like 70,000 people who have a reason to come to Cambridge every day. Now, some of those are housed by those institutions, the undergraduates, but the graduates, the staff, and the faculty are not, by and large. So do we need to have some conversations with our big institutions, and then we could probably lump all of our high-tech folks down in Kendall Square together and say that's another X thousands of people who have a reason to come to Cambridge every day. We've talked a little bit about that with the incentive zoning. It's kind of a nod in that direction. But to what extent do we want to encourage these institutions, which are a big reason for the demand that's so out of whack, to participate in the housing solutions?
Now, if I can point one more finger somewhere. I want to bring the state into this too, because part of this has to do with transportation, has to do with public transportation. And if you have more state investment into public infrastructure and sort of inter-municipal investments, you actually do make it easier for people who work at those institutions and work at Kendall Square to not have to live in Cambridge if they don't want to, or feel obligated to because it just takes them too much time to get back and forth.
Many years ago, I lived for a few months in a new town outside of Stockholm, in a little place, a little cluster of retail and residential. And one 10-story apartment building was a dormitory for the University of Stockholm. It was all 100% full of students. And they would trundle every morning over to the subway stop, right, 5-minute walk from their apartment building. 20 minutes later, they went downtown Stockholm going to school. So it's not like those kind of solutions that you're pointing out, Curt, couldn't happen easily in this. Oh, except for the people in the places out there that aren't sure they want a dormitory place in their town. So you're quite right to point a little bit to some regional thinking and some infrastructure planning.
Great. I want to bring more people into this conversation, and that's all of you. I think this is a great time to open it up to questions. So just the tips are to ask a question, put a question mark at the end of it, and we'll try to keep the conversation going. I have to turn up this microphone, so come on up, and I'll get it turned up. Give me 1 second.
Hello? It's really loud now. I have a few comments to make. For one, I lived in Montreal for quite a number of years, and that is we had rent control. So therefore, people who were artists, writers, musicians, people who just didn't have a lot of money could actually live in a neighborhood and plan to stay for a long time. We had much more stable communities. My daughter went to the same school for her the whole time we were there. I think that's something we should revisit, is the notion of rent control here. I really think that in this country we have to have a revolution, honestly, to make this, either we're going to have a country completely oriented towards wealthy people, Cambridge can become a gated community, and the hell with everybody else, or we're going to unify and say, no, that isn't what we want. I thought it was very interesting that you made this point early on, that the homeowners get more tax incentives than the poor do for subsidies. Now, why is that? I'll tell you why. Because very wealthy people are running this country. They're the ones who are funding our elections, and they get in there and they get laws that they want. So the poor people are not the ones who have the lobbyists. We're not funding the lobbyists, and we outnumber. The very, very wealthy people are far outnumbered by all the people not very wealthy, whether you're poor or middle class. And I think that we need to get organized to change that. The other thing I want to say is I've actually had the experience of being here, working, getting laid off. I ended up in a nice conflict with Cambridge Housing because they bought my building and forced me and some other people out. After I fought very hard, I was offered a unit where I now live. I will say that that's not, you do end up feeling very trapped, because if you get even a few more dollars, your food stamps go down, your rent goes up. So you can't get out of it. You feel like you're completely trapped in that situation. Either you're going to suddenly luck out and get a 40K or 50K job or 100K job, or you're going to stay stuck. So I think the issue is broader than, having more programs and so forth. I think we need to really change the whole system. Thanks. My name is Jan, by the way.
So let's talk about rent control. What is the city's role with that? Is it possible? Is it?
You never know what you got till it's gone.
Yeah, right.
It's not going to. I can't see it coming back. I mean,
okay.
That ship has sailed, I believe.
And why do you say that?
Well, I think that's been decided by the state referendum.
It would take a revolution.
A serious question is who it would serve at this moment.
Right.
Because it's very, very difficult to roll rents back.
Right.
To say you landlords have got to reduce your rents by 20% or 30% or 40%. That's really a pretty much political non-starter. And therefore, if we freeze rents at 1,800, 2,200, 27, whatever they are now, right, we're really just protecting rents, not for poor people anymore. So I'm not sure rent control specifically is the tool for now. Right. It was the right tool for then. It was a great tool for then. It was getting close to have run its course when it finally was eliminated. It was silly to eliminate it, but I'm not sure it would solve our problem now. I think we might be protecting incomes, this is to Cheryl-Ann's point a little bit, protecting rents for people who are in pretty good shape already financially.
Well, what I found interesting in the interviews for the city manager, Mr. Di Pasquale, actually talked about rent control. He talked about it, there's this state law that prohibits us from doing this locally, but is there a way to think about it regionally? And he said, I'm very open to that. I don't know what that means, but I think that's pretty interesting.
I think that we can have rent control if the people decide. We can have whatever we want if we stop getting brainwashed by these people who have money to, put endless advertisements explaining to us why we shouldn't want to have programs that benefit us. So I definitely, anything can change, but we have to have a movement of the people to make that happen, and stop letting a few rich people decide everything for everyone else. That is not the way it should be.
Mm-hmm. And you guys are saying so this is a political choice. You don't see that political choice happening anytime soon?
I have to agree with Jim. First of all, I think it's politically unrealistic, even if it was an organized effort. Secondly, I think Jim's right. If you go and look, an efficiency that is in reasonable condition in an efficiency apartment, 320 square feet, you're right around $1,600 a month. When you drop below that number and start getting into the 1,500s and the 1,400s, a lot of the listings are rooms for rent. So I think it would be difficult to install a rent control approach.
Okay.
Cheryl-Ann's comment, though, about regional may have more pathways in it, because we're here in Cambridge with our set of problems. Boston's across the river when the Red Sox play. But otherwise, we don't see the pattern. There is a pattern. And it would be nice to step back a little bit beyond our borders and see how we fit. I think that's worth looking at to see if there's a policy in there of some kind.
It also sounds hard.
It is hard.
Right,
yes,
to get all those cities to work together. But yeah, do you want to add something?
This is a quick story. If people followed what happened with the Harding Street neighbors a year ago, these were people who had never had a rental subsidy. They were living in a few buildings in East Cambridge. The owner sold. The new owner paid way too much and immediately tried to harass the tenants and jack up the rents. And so one person, and what CHA did, they actually expanded the criteria for emergencies. And so a couple of people there, a couple of households were able to qualify for this in-place voucher, but the landlord has to agree to take that voucher so that person can remain there. Well, the tenant who organized the tenant group and was the first one that the landlord picked out to try and evict, she felt very conflicted about accepting this voucher, because she said, well, you're going to pay this guy, and I won't say what she called him, over $1,400 for this apartment that doesn't have heat in the bedroom. So I can continue to live in Cambridge with my 5 cats. And she felt very conflicted about this. She loves her neighborhood. She loved her neighbors, many of whom, had to leave. Right? So her argument to me was, well, this makes things worse. And I had to say to her, take the voucher. And so that's the dilemma that you're in, right?
Right.
Do you know, I just want to ask Greg, could you just tell us what the voucher, what the pay is? Because there's a big gap between what a voucher actually will pay, for example, for a 1-bedroom apartment and the cost of a 1-bedroom here. There are not anywhere near enough units here because the voucher is so low. Is that correct?
No, the voucher's not low.
How much?
It's low compared to the market we're in, because we either can, there's a term called a payment standard.
Okay.
And that payment standard is based on what's called a fair market rent, which is decided by the federal government. We're obligated under the voucher program to pay a reasonable rent. Our payment standards are currently 125% of the number that HUD provides us. They're one of the highest in the region.
But how does that
Okay.
Because without getting too detailed, the higher you go in the payment standard, the fewer families you can assist, because you don't get any more money for a high payment standard. So you're in that.
Jan, I appreciate your comments, because this is about what kind of city we want to be. Next question.
Hi. My name is Laura. I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Cambridge. I've benefited from some of these programs
Hold it up nice and close.
over time. Lifelong resident.
All right, I'm going to turn her up.
Hi.
Hang on one second.
You're going to turn me up, okay? Hi, I'm Laura Booth, and I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Cambridge. I've benefited from some of these programs that we see up here, and my mother worked for Polaroid over when it was Tech Square, and I've seen the changes in the neighborhood. I live on Columbia Street now and have for 15 years. Those are just my credentials. But what I wanted to ask was, I don't know, Greg, or whether or not you were, Jim, at the first, I know Cheryl-Ann was. when we had the presentation a couple of weeks back. I was very engaged by Barry Bluestone's discussion of solutions. And just a couple of things that seemed elegant in their simplicity if we're talking about an appetite for diversity and different kinds of housing and moving people through the system, as I think we all want to do. You know, one of his solutions, which we've all talked about in this community over time, is figure out what to do with the students. Figure out what to do with the students, put the pressures on the university to house. But the second thing that he talked about, you know, in a long presentation, I'm just summarizing, is the idea of modular housing to give folks an opportunity that want to come out of subsidized housing but are afraid of falling off many cliffs. You know, starter homes. I benefited from HRI in a limited equity situation. Same kind of thing. It was a way to move forward. I wasn't a resident of public housing.
Okay.
We rented in North Cambridge. But those kinds of things, a way for some mobility in the system of students, of elders, of working folks so they can build a little bit of equity if they need to, or have a place that they have an ownership stake in, regardless of income. And I'm just wondering if other folks are kind of pulled in the same way that I was by some of his ideas.
Who'd like to take that? Jim?
The city has an active first-time homebuyer program. It's been extremely successful. It's enabled the city to provide through the trust funds some assistance to help people buy a home. And I have to say, including you, great, Laura. And an interesting statistic: that first-time homebuyers program comes with an educational program. There's something like 580 of those homes in this city. In the great foreclosure crisis, given the counseling and preparation that the city does for those first-time home buyers, 1 foreclosure. So it is possible for people of modest means to own a home with some assistance from the city. The tricky part of that is you have to decide, when you have a program like that, is this a program for creating a permanent stock of affordable first-time homes? In which case you place a limit on what that home can be resold for, so that it comes back around over and over again. Or do you want to create a wealth building program where the person who buys the home gets a chance to join up with the big real estate escalation and make a fortune? But then we got to start over for the next house, for the next round of people. So that's a decision for a city to make. At this point, our city has decided we want that to be a permanent stock. Once there's a house in that stock, we want to limit the resale and therefore make it available to the next person who can afford it. So there is a program like that in Cambridge. I think it's about as creatively designed and administered as you can make it. On your question of modular housing, this, I think, is a national tragedy that we haven't spent more time on this. The European countries use modular systems all the time. It's such a small industry in this country right now that it's not a lot less expensive than stick building a house. And the reason is the volume is so low that the things that would normally be a cost-saving advantage for those companies just don't exist. What we need is a system where those things roll off the line and they go get put on a site as fast as they roll off the line. And if we had a system like that, if we had an idea for a system like that under the Nixon administration called Operation Breakthrough, which was termed by many of us to be Operation Breakdown when it failed so miserably, because it was really a political gambit to raise money for the Nixon campaign funds. But we've missed the boat on that, and I think it's one worth a lot of time on.
That's great. Let's go to you next for the next question. Maybe just speak into the mic and don't pick it up because it makes a little bit of crackling noise. Just leave it there and speak into it. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I also know we were going to get a question from Smarika, so please get in line over here because we want to hear from you too.
I think you have to speak very closely, and then it comes out. Yes, hold about 2 or 3 inches away. First of all, plaudits for the panel and for the Historic Society. Number 1, for very close attention to the microphones. I have a slight hearing deficiency, and I heard every word tonight.
That's good to hear.
So, the other thing is, I always say this when it happens, but thank you all for not using PowerPoint.
I'll just hold this up. You keep talking.
Okay. Let me just comment slight criticism here for the panel, because the topic for tonight was historical one. What have been the successes and failures of affordable housing planning and activism? And I can think of two that weren't even mentioned at all. Not even mentioned at all. The first is the Inner Belt. It would have taken 1,500 to 2,000 housing units. It triggered another roadway proposal, which would have taken another 500 to 1,000 housing units, many businesses. And the city of Cambridge responded in 1967 with a full court press of every government agency, except the planning board and except the city planner. Everybody, including the city manager and the city council, were against the Inner Belt and in favor of housing.
And what's the other one?
The other one is urban renewal. Cambridge Redevelopment Authority. It was going to clear out all of Cambridgeport and most of Riverside. Just bulldoze the housing. That would have been a tremendous loss of affordable housing we could never get back. And it was stopped in 1962. And you didn't mention it.
So sorry.
Thank you.
You're quite right on both counts.
I missed the 60s too.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, yeah. I didn't miss the 60s.
Yeah. Okay, next. Great. That's good.
Good evening. My name's Jay Henderson, and I've been living in Massachusetts since the age of 5 years old. I've been homeless since 2009. So if I said to you, I've been homeless since 2009, you say, oh, you don't look homeless. So what does a homeless person supposed to look like? What I really would like to just say is that everybody is here because we're looking for answers. We want to know what the next phase is. The gentleman before me did ask the question, so what have been the successes and failures of affordable housing, rent-controlled housing, which we know has come and gone. I'm very happy to see some people for the second time because I attended the first meeting, and that there is diversity and a wealth of information that's here before us on coming to some answers and some conclusions and solutions to a crisis that we're really having. So my question is, and I'll be brief, when you wake up in the morning, most of us have jobs here, right? Just because I'm homeless, that doesn't mean I don't work. Okay, when we walk over to the CVS or down the street and see someone sleeping inside the bank when I want to withdraw money, that's not comfortable to me. I don't think that's comfortable to anybody that understands that, like, wait a minute, I just left a house, or do I have a home? So here in Cambridge or throughout Boston, greater Boston, the question being, who should live in Cambridge? Who should live anywhere? Well, we're in America, it's supposed to be the greatest country, one of the greatest countries in the world, right? So we should all have a right to be able to live. Like we said, we should all have a right to be able to have shelter, right? Bob Dylan said, hey, I want to give you shelter, comfort from the storm, right? So who should live in Cambridge? Who should live anywhere? So if you work a job, I think it's an insult. I think it's very bad to our humanity, our place, our sense of being, that if I work and now I see a community and I look at this community as my extended family, because we're really all extended family, okay? So if I'm working and I can't live in a community because of the amount of money that I make, or the color of my skin, or the decision that someone is making because they're in their comfort zone, right? That's not going to work. So I think some of the answers, because this panel we live in a very complicated situation. We're living in hard times, difficult times to deal with, and it's complicated. This panel can't answer all those questions, okay? So we're all here because we want some answers. We all have ideas, and if we don't, then we need to have someone to spark those ideas. And that one spark that comes from that idea, I say, is love. because we're all here because somebody loves somebody else that caused you to be here, and they're concerned about you. They want to give you something to have that love. So if we take that away, how are we going to help each other? So I think some of the solutions, some of the answers to that solution is that we have to think in a creative way. We need to use creative financing, creative resources. Rent control is gone, but there's still incentives such as rent to own, lease with an option, lease purchase, which are two different things. Many ways that we can use our community with what we have. I walk around when I'm homeless at night because some nights I didn't get a place to stay with a friend or a family. And I see all these abandoned houses, all these houses, no one's in them. Shouldn't I be able to say, man, it's cold out here, right? It's snowing on me right now, right? So what do you think a person like that is going to do? I might decide to, kind of go in there and find a little spot to sleep for the evening. Didn't do no harm, didn't hurt no one, right? So if we're going to work jobs, and I'll close out here and be brief, I think we all need to start looking at some creative incentives in our workplace, going to our human resources departments, sending in letters to Congress and to our United States government and saying, if we work a job and someone is going to set what my wage of pay is going to be, and if my wage of pay is going to be minimum wage, which none of us can live off minimum wage, and we're building houses, but only the rich can buy into those houses, then why aren't there some incentives that say that if I'm going to be paid minimum wage, that there also are homes for me to live in, either a rental or a way to purchase that property if I've been working a job for more than 10 years that match what my income is, and give each American person that opportunity to have that peace and shelter in their mind and where they're going. Even in our workplace, we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a 6-minute commercial, but we can't pay. You'll be able to speak, man. But we can't pay or find affordable housing for the people who are working for those same companies who are spending that money. We need to think creatively.
Thank you, Jay. So, thanks for sparking some questions there. That question, like who should live in Cambridge, let me just, maybe this is one that we'll come back to, but I do want you to think about in the meantime, if there's that federal law from 1948 that you talked about, Jim, that sort of said what housing should be in the United States, maybe we should listen to those comments, and I just want you to think about what should that quote be for Cambridge? What should the goal for housing in Cambridge be? But we'll come back to that. Next question. And we love questions with a question mark at the end.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much for this panel, and I'll try to be brief. My name is Aisha Dinsmore.
Step up just a little more. Yeah, you're great.
My name is Aisha Dinsmore Bay, and I'm an architect, and I am also a student of strategic design and management at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. So I'm doing a thesis about housing, especially as it respects to the creative economy. And what I wanted to know is, because I'm also thinking about megacities, and this housing problem is not just obviously indicative of the conditions in Cambridge or in Boston or whatever, it's a global problem. And so when thinking about megacities and population growth, we have to start thinking differently about how we live. And so yes, housing vouchers and kind of all of that, but we need to start thinking differently about how we occupy space, how much space one human being needs to live. And so with
this goes back to the density question.
Correct.
Right.
It goes back to the density
issue, yeah.
Yes. And so what I would like to know is, how are we thinking, and I know this is is the beginning, of the process, but how are people thinking? What are we doing to kind of change people's thinking in regards to how much space we actually use, how we live, like I think it's either in Finland or in Sweden, one of them, I can't remember the country, but they have millennials, younger people now living in retirement homes, and it's this new idea of community, something that people would have thought was unfathomable, years ago. So that's what I want to know is what are we doing to think about communal housing? What are we thinking about if there are homeless people, would they just need a room? We can offer things like that. Like, what are we doing to push the conversation to a different paradigm from what we're doing now to accommodate the future?
Great
It's
question.
a really great question. Curt, if I could,
Yeah.
just a couple of pieces of information you might appreciate. Our housing stock in this country is by and large continues to be thought about and designed for the so-called prototypical American family. That's 2 parents and 2 children. I think 1 boy and 1 girl is required. That family, 2 parents and 2 children, that family is exactly 17% of our households now. 17%. So that's the wrong way to think about what housing should be. That's sort of point 1. Point 2, in 1950, the average starter home, that first home you buy after you're through renting, was 900 square feet. Today, it's 2,600 square feet. 2,600 square feet costs more to build, costs more to maintain, costs more to heat, and hurts our planet in a much more serious way. So we do have to think about the sharing economy. Is there some way that we can build housing that allows people to share various elements of their housing in a way that is still useful for them but will cost much less per square foot? Are there ways to design smaller houses? The small house movement is getting a little bit of traction. The 250 square foot apartment isn't for everybody, but there are some people for whom pretty much they just need a place to lay their head at night, and then they're okay for the rest of the time.
I should mention that
there's a bunch of creative stuff going on. They're small little movements, but I encourage you to pay attention to them. When you see a story in the paper, when you read a magazine article, talk to your neighbors about that kind of thing, because I think changing how we think about the housing stock and how we'll use it as the kind of population we're becoming is a much more creative kind of thing. It even speaks to the previous question a bit.
The Cambridge Historical Society did a history cafe where they talked about tiny houses, and one of the interesting sort of ironies is that tiny houses are very easy to build out in the country where there's no regulation. The places where they're needed the most in a city like Cambridge, it's the hardest to actually build and get through because of neighborhoods and everybody else.
And we should say, somebody said it earlier, and they're exactly right. Our building code is something we made up. So we get to change it if we want to. It's not on some stone carved, but and it came down from a mountain someplace.
Yep.
So we can change those things if we want to.
Greg, you brought up density in the first place, so do you want to respond to that too?
Well, I have to say I've been following the small movement, and I sort of haven't articulated it, but in the back of my mind, the principles of design that are embedded in those units would be interesting to apply to apartments for rent. But to Jim's point, they probably don't meet any minimum standards for some of the code requirements we have, and we'd have to talk about that. But I think that's worth thinking about. I think there are folks that could live in a smaller space if it's designed in a different way. And by that I mean if it's designed for that space to be used efficiently and in a maximum way and still make you feel comfortable. And the small house movement is really kind of trying to balance those things. It'd be interesting to try one to scale.
Yeah.
Well, my concern would be who gets to decide who lives in the micro unit or the small house, the tiny house. Who gets to decide that?
You do. You do.
Yeah,
Then
the person does.
Well,
We
then we're
do.
fine. I wanted to mention that the majority of people who are applying for a CHA voucher right now are 1 or 2 person households. That's where the really big demand is. And people who live in the big house, they're missing out on the sort of connectedness that I feel with my neighbors and the mutual support that we provide for one another and the community that we've built together. You all are missing out on that.
More trade-offs. Yeah. Next question.
So this is the second time dense tall buildings has been brought up for Cambridge. And the first one, Barry Bluestone, talked about them as well. And since we only have limited amount of time in our lives, I'm looking for help understanding how to make tall, dense, micro-unit packed buildings allowed in this city. Where do I go? Who do I yell at? You said we made up our building codes. How do we get that to happen in this city? Because that's the only way to go, in my opinion, is up. There's no room for small houses, and they're not efficient anyway.
There are 2 points of leverage around that question. We have a building code in this city, so one can go and talk to the building department about mostly how it's administered. Our building code, Chris, correct me, but our building code is enabled by the state. They produce a standard state building code, and so some of the advocacy needs to be at the state level about modifying the code to allow local communities to make greater variations to that code than we are allowed to make right now.
Okay.
So it's both, the specific leverage for that is some at the state level and some at the local level.
Look at this, we're talking about building code and everybody's still here. It's amazing. Yeah. I want to round out with 2 more questions. Smrika, let's start with you. And I will also say that you're going to hang around afterwards, so this conversation is going to continue. But we'll go to 2 more questions, closing thoughts, and then continue.
You're looking at 3 people who can talk about this issue until they shut the lights off tonight.
Exactly. So go up and bend their ears. Go for it. You live in this neighborhood, right?
Yeah, I live across the street.
Great.
I also go to the public high school here, Cambridge and Latin. I'm 16, probably the youngest one here, but I'm going off to college in a few years, and I'd really like to, after college, I'd like to move back into Cambridge. You mentioned sort of that we should have a housing movement, and I want to know how you propose we sort of launch that and how you ensure the longevity of that for younger residents such as myself.
Start with you, Cheryl-Ann.
All of you need to show up to every housing meeting that takes place in the city. And believe me, I go to them every night, every afternoon. More of you need to show up to start making the connections and trying to understand the housing system that we have. The other challenge I would say is that it's and we haven't gotten too weedy here tonight, but it's very technical language when you talk about housing. It would be lovely to build, 3-deckers on city-owned parking lots, but, it usually takes about 13 different funding sources cobbled together to create any affordable housing. So the more we understand this and support one another and support building different types of housing that are affordable to sort of all of us in this room, that's really important. And the challenge for low-income tenants who are living in some form of subsidized housing, it's really hard to understand what kind of housing that you're living in. Greg has not mentioned RAD tonight. I'm very surprised about that. The Housing Authority is in the process of converting all of its federal public housing to project-based voucher tax credit housing that will be operated as if it's public housing. So try and digest that. Right? And that's what low-income people
That's why I didn't mention it.
And that's what low-income people have to understand to be able to protect their rights. They have to understand what kind of housing they're living in and have a say in it.
All right. We're off to a good start with that today. Go for it.
As we look forward to the 3rd session, I wanted to know, how do you see the globalization of real estate affecting the housing market in Cambridge, and might that be a 2-sided coin? Are there ways we can leverage international flows of money to actually create or buy down occupancy costs?
I've been trying to get the Housing Authority to get some property into Caymans for a long time, but apparently I've been unsuccessful in that. But I do think it impacts because this community is attractive if you're an investor. And I think that's one of the contributors to the price that Jim mentioned. And they're in the market competing for an investment, and we're in the market competing for units and homes. And sometimes I think those two things are just not compatible. So I do think there is an impact. I'm not sure about the flip part of your question, but I do think if one of the reasons that we've gotten interest in the RAD that Cheryl-Ann mentions and attracted what would be called a private equity investor is because they know if somehow the housing authority messes up, the land itself is as valuable as anything that they own. So yes, there is an investment pool here that I think has the potential to drive prices in the wrong direction.
That's interesting.
It's really a critical question. One element of the question I'll ask is that it is true in this luxury market that lots and lots of international money is finding its way here because this is a better thing. U.S. real estate is a better investment than investing at home in Russia, in China, in Brazil, and other parts of the world where wealth is being accumulated. And rather than invest at home where they're not so sure about the marketplace, they will bring their money here. Now what that means is in the luxury market, we have a bunch of apartments that are simply vacant because people don't intend to live there, and they don't even want to rent it out. They just want to invest. And that's a big problem for a community. And I don't know how serious that particular problem is in Cambridge yet, but I'm pretty sure that there's some of that sitting around. So we need to be concerned about it because I don't know what happens when that money leaves, right? When suddenly it's not so good to invest in American real estate. Instead, you'd rather be invested in oil futures off the shores of Alaska. And so you pull your money out of these, you sell your apartment. If a bunch of those get sold all at the same time, what does that do to the marketplace here in Cambridge? I'm not sure about that. I'm not enough of an economist to be able to say anything about that. But I do want to say my turn for a controversial thing.
Yeah.
I would like...
Don't open up a can of worms, though, because we're trying to wrap this up.
I intend to open up a big can of worms.
Okay.
If I get my dream, no for-profit entity owns any rental housing. Because Greg used exactly the right words. You think of the physical space in which you live as your home. An investor thinks of it as an investment. And when that investor needs some cash, and they're just working on a spreadsheet, they look at their several assets and say, let's see, if I sell this one, I can get enough cash to do whatever else I want to do. Send my kid to college, pay for an operation for my wife, take a trip to the Caymans with Greg. Mm-hmm. So I finally don't want a physical space ever to be in contention between someone who thinks of it as home and someone who thinks of it as an investment. So I would like all rental housing to be owned by a public entity, the housing authority, city, some other public body that's transparent and that you can get your hands on as the public, or by a nonprofit organization whose motivation is providing housing for people that need it, of whatever category they're serving, older people, people with disabilities, families, younger, older, and not by somebody who thinks of that physical space as an investment.
Okay. We've heard here about the global world that we live in. We also live in this local world where we get to decide what kind of city we're in. You just said one thing that's your dream. What's your dream for Cambridge housing?
I'd like...
very briefly, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add about 1,000 hard units.
Okay.
Affordable units.
Be specific, yeah, right.
Of various sizes and various design ideas, and try them out.
Okay.
It would be loved to try out some of the design stuff. And one last comment, if anyone's interested, this is the original specification book for the construction of Newtown Court in 1936. issued by the Federal Emergency Administration of Public Works, the Housing Division, Washington, D.C., if you want to take a look at it.
Awesome.
So since we're at a Historical Society event.
Thanks for bringing that. Yeah.
Talk about
Cheryl-Ann,
geeky.
Cheryl-Ann, what's your dream?
I had wanted to mention something about preservation, so I'll just say that quickly. There are over 600 units of affordable housing that are at risk of losing their affordability in the next 4 years. Everyone should pay attention to that. We can't afford to lose all of those homes. But my dream for low-income people in this city to recognize how much expertise they have around housing issues, to wake up every morning and say, you are the city's housing expert.
Aren't these folks great? Let's give them a big hand. Thanks so much for being part of this conversation. Let me hand it over to Marika Van Dam.
Thanks, Curt. One more time, a thank you to Cheryl-Ann, Greg, and Jim for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, guys. And also the most handsome moderator that I know, my husband, Curt. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I just want to thank one more time our very generous sponsors listed here, our very generous host of the Cambridge Community Center. Any folks affiliated with the center, if you could just give a wave there in the back. Hey, Corinne. Our superstar from conversation number 1 is here. Did anybody learn something new tonight? Just you learned something new? Awesome. So I just want to reiterate that if you find value in programming like this, where we're having conversations around issues that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do, I hope you'll consider joining as a member or possibly just throwing some bucks in our donation box down at the back. And thank you for coming. Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you at our 3rd and final conversation on November 17th here in Central Square at the Library Branch.